Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
We like the feeling of progress, and folks figured out a while ago that you can always tweak things in your surroundings to heighten a perceived movement through time, even if, in truth, you haven't advanced anywhere meaningful at all.
Pretty good quote. That's a good one. Well, I'm Shaun.
I'm Daniel.
And we have a very special guest today, and that guest is speculative short fiction writer Thomas Ha. Welcome very much to the show.
Hey guys, thank you for having me. I like what you did there with the quote. I was muted. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I appreciated the pull from the collection.
It was a great quote.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So Thomas is a Nebula, Ignite, Hugo, Locus, and Shirley Jackson Award-nominated writer of speculative short fiction. You can find his work in a lot of places: Clarkesworld, Lightspeed, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Weird Horror Magazine, many other publications. His work has also appeared in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy and the Year's Best Dark Fantasy and Horror, which is pretty cool. But today, we're here to talk about this book, that is Uncertain Suns and Other Stories, out now from Undertow, which is exciting. It did have bookmarks, but mine are not. They're in a box. I moved after I got the book, so they went in a box. I apologize. Please don't hate me. But it is out September 16th. So by the time you hear this, it is actually out if you're listening on the podcast version. And so it's exciting.
Yeah, so before we get into our discussion with Thomas, a reminder to our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com listener suggestions. If you aren't already, join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be part of that interactive live streaming show format. And those of you on Twitch, please send your questions in for Thomas as we're going through this. So finally, be sure to review and spread the word about our show, please. Help support us through our Patreon and be a part of our Torture Cinema polls, our live watches, and other special Patreon-only events on Discord.
Perfect. All right, Thomas, we got to start with a big question, which I don't know how many people with a collection of stories we've actually interviewed. You might be either the first or the second. And so this is an interesting question, because normally we're like, oh, tell us about the book. But normally it's one story of a book. You have many. So how would you describe this collection, I guess, to somebody who's never picked it up yet?
Gosh, that is a great question. And again, thank you for having me on. I probably should have hammered out like an elevator pitch to describe the book by now. You'd think I would have. But I guess the way I would describe it is it's a group of stories over the last, 4 or 5 years of my career. They are multi-genre, so some sci-fi, some dark fantasy, some horror. A lot of them are in between because I never really like sticking to just one genre if I can help it. But they all more or less center around the theme of, much like the title suggests, uncertainty, fear, indecision, doubt. And, a lot of these are short stories about groups of people, usually families, but not always families, individuals, interpersonal relationships, where something's going on and it's weird or threatening or strange, just, outside of the corner of their vision, outside your front door. And it's sort of about how I think different people, different characters react when they're placed in those sorts of situations. That's really, I think, the things that interest me, is the way people confront their fears or don't confront their fears, and why that might be. So it's very vague and very abstract, I know, but I think, if you like short stories, you'll probably like it. There's something in there for everybody, but it's definitely dark. I'll say that.
I don't blame you for that.
That sounds like a great summation.
That's a great summation, because you kind of have to. Like, how do I make sense of all this stuff together? I'm really glad that you'd mentioned some of the sort of themes of you said uncertainty, which is in the title, because many of these are things where like the answers are not clear cut of what's kind of going on. The one that came into mind as you were talking was actually Sweet Baby, which is this story where on the one hand, the genre is a little uncertain because it is science fiction in elements, but it's also quite distinctly horror in other elements. It is also a story where with the ending of that story, which I don't think we need to spoil, is very curious and doesn't have like a very... there's no sort of like moment of revelation in the sense of like the story has like an obvious moment. This is it. It's done. Everything's solved. It's more of there's a continuation. We know there's more story after this. It's just this story is done now. And I guess I'm curious why for you that sort of element of uncertainty, which is in so many of these stories of that, where the stories don't have very clear-cut, hard lines. What as a storyteller is so interesting about that for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just on another podcast recently about horror, and we talked about weird horror quite a bit. And that's, usually where I get categorized. I'm one of those writers that's really frustrating where I try not to say what a story is or where it fits. And I'm like, let the editors decide, let the readers decide. My work is done. But I will say that part of the reason I think I end up being put in the weird horror box is because a lot of that subgenre is driven on ambiguity and sort of the dread and the unsettling feeling you get when things are not dealt with finality a lot of times. And I think there are many reasons I'm drawn to that personally as a storyteller, but I think one of the main reasons for me personally is just that I think it's a reality thing, it's a verisimilitude thing. I'm just the type of person where I just when a story wraps up too neatly, I don't buy into it. I have trouble with it. I've never known life to operate that way. I've never known myself to walk out of a situation where I go, that was my life lesson. This is my revelation. I am now a better person for X, Y, or Z. It's always messy and it's always strange. That being said, it's funny you bring up the example of Sweet Baby, and I don't want to spoil it either, or talk about exactly the ending. But I think I do try to build into a lot of the stories a feeling of something being changed, even if slightly. And it's always a slight change. So I can see what you're saying. And this is going to be maybe frustrating for viewers because we're all talking in generality. We're moving around the ending and not saying anything. I know exactly what you're talking about when you say that it kind of ends on this open note and you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know where the story's really going to go or how the characters in it are going to react to each other from that point going forward. But I do think, from my perspective, the main character, the young girl, Fran, I think she has a little bit of a different outlook about her brother, her family. Just some background for listeners. I mean, it's about a very screwed up family dynamic where, arguably everyone is trying to do the right thing, arguably, but, maybe not inexcusably. They're trying to preserve something, a certain way of life. They can't face a certain issue that their family has. And as a result, there are all these negative consequences for other members of the family, specifically the main character in particular, who has to suffer because of certain decisions that her family has made about how they're going to operate as a unit. And I do think at the end of that story, she comes out with a little bit, I don't want to say sympathy or empathy or understanding, but she comes away with a little bit of a detached, maybe this is this way because they're trying their best. Maybe this is this way because they don't know any better. But I need to find my own solution for approaching this. And she does find her own sort of solution out of it. I can't spoil it. But this is a very long roundabout way of saying, even when it's very open-ended, even if you don't know what'll happen next, I try to give a little bit of something where the character or some of the characters have gone through something and come out at least a little bit changed. If that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense.
No, that does. Because a lot of the stories feature that at the end, those last moments, there's uncertainty of what might exactly happen. There's sometimes uncertainty over what did happen previously, of how it all fits together. But you get the sense of that complete, particularly the character arc. The stories have that very strong character arc that runs through them, where at the end, the character has come to some decision or conclusion of where they need to go next, right? So they have some sense of it, even if we as the reader don't necessarily know what those steps are going to be. And we can guess, we can kind of make our interpretations, and I love that about it. But you get the finality of, and the satisfaction that within this plot and within this character arc, they have reached that sort of conclusion.
That's the hope, at least. I hope that's the case, that there's at least a little bit to hold on to. And it's funny that you bring that up, because I've been thinking about this. I do think one of the number one reader reactions I have gotten, especially early in my writing career, but pretty consistently, is what the heck happened? Or I don't understand. Very frustrated. Certain types of readers, they need certainty. They need something to hold on to. And I do not fault them. I think that's very natural, and it makes sense to me. So if I do ramp up the weirdness, or if I ramp up the ambiguity in, say, the world or creatures they might encounter or the scenario, for me as a storyteller personally, I think it's more important to then have a grounding in the narrator, the character, the relationships. And that's actually why I've thought about this a bit lately. I return to family a lot, because that is a very familiar touchstone for a lot of people. Maybe not everyone, but if you start with a brother and a sister, or a father and a son, or a grandparent and a grandchild, usually most people have enough past experience to immediately be locked in to the motivation of a character, or at least have some sort of understanding. So even if it's a bad mother and father, an abusive mother and father, which arguably the Sweet Baby situation is, you don't have to necessarily be from an abusive background to understand, but you have enough familiar grounding in it to be like, well, that would be horrible if my parents treated me this way, or my brother treated me this way. And that gives you something to then carry you through to figure out, what the heck is going on. Maybe not everybody. Maybe people still eject and it's still too frustrating. But I do think upping the character motivation and focusing on those personal decisions that you were talking about, that for me as a storyteller is what I'm most interested in.
So actually, that made me think of one of the stories, and I'm blanking which one it is now in my brain, so you'll probably remember quicker than I will. It features a mother-son relationship that becomes more important as the story continues, but I won't say it's a B plot, but it's like something beyond that's very relatable next to the more weird aspects of the plot of that story.
Right. Are you thinking of the Brotherhood of Montague Street video?
It is. That's it. Yes. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another one. That's a really great example of what I think I was trying to do. And again, I'm trying to be careful about how to describe things.
Right.
I should have warned you up top. I'm a very frustrating interviewee, because whenever someone points out, it's like, hey, what is this about? What is the inspiration? I dodge left and right, and I try to swim around.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, no, but that's a great example, because that story, again, for listeners, just general background, it's sort of in a near future, or arguably far future, New York City. A guy finds a book. It's an unusual book because they call it a dead book. It's essentially print media in a world where, as you go through the story, you gradually find out, media is constantly shifting, constantly being rewritten, very, very hard to pin down, and that's the norm. And understandably, a lot of readers, what they like is, the technology aspects, the quirks of the world that are a little off, that are kind of like our world, but people behave a little oddly and differently.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff that sounds bad to say it this way, but I can't think of another way to say it. The surface level stuff, the world building stuff, that interests people. But really, the understory, or the driving engine of the story for me, is, like you pointed out, this character is going through the grieving process of losing his mother and is getting rid of her stuff, her physical effects, her media. And that's, a lot of his relationship to things, to books, to stories is through his mom, and trying to figure out, how he feels about his mother, and how memory and the way we record memory, and when we do fix our memories down, how that helps us evaluate where we go and how we grow as people, and the impact that it has on him. And for that story in particular, I don't need to go on this long tangent if you don't want to, but I figure we might as...
No, that's perfect.
Yeah, but I mean, so for that one, that story, what I want to explore for someone like that, a character like that, is when you're going through the grieving process and you're handling your mother's estate, this character has an impulse. You can feel a push and pull, a tension between two different impulses, really, to forget and to eject everything and try to push it out of view and distract yourself, or really focus in on the painful stuff and put your hand on the stove and like burn yourself essentially, but face it head on. And without spoiling the ending, I think you can probably guess where this is headed. I mean, this is a character who discovers about himself he's not the type of person who can just distract himself or erase things or let things go and just let everything evaporate into the atmosphere the way that his society wants to. He's someone who wants to fixate. He can't let go of his experiences, and in particular that relationship with his mother, which is very flawed and not great, but he wants to focus on the good and the bad. So at the end of the story, God, how do I do this without spoiling?
Yeah, don't go there.
He comes out with a different mindset than he started with. That's really where I'm going with this with this spiel. And that's, to me, the kind of thing that drives a story.
And like you said with Sweet Baby, you talked about the word preserve, trying to preserve something versus dealing with the loss of something. And they're two like opposing, tugging things. And that story, both of these stories kind of deal with that, I guess, in a large respect. So is that something that you have returned to? I'll let Shaun talk after this. Sorry.
Oh, you don't need to apologize. I'm the one who's going on the long hill. So, yeah, I mean, you're a great interviewer, by the way. Can I just say that?
All right, thank you.
No, the way you sum that up, I think that tension in particular does run through much of the book. This is the closest I'll get to like saying the thesis of the collection or jumping out. But there's a story in here, and I give this away in the acknowledgments, that there are 3 stories that I think of as the keystone stories that are connected, which is House Traveler, The Sort, and then finally Uncertain Suns, which ends the whole collection. And I think of that as sort of the conclusion or capstone of a lot of the themes. But, a lot of what they talk about in House Traveler runs in the rest is this fear of change, I think. It's this point that I think a lot of the characters reach that I'm interested in, where your personal relationships, your family, the loves of your life, whatever it is, those are positive things, and your personal attachments are positive things. They drive you, they motivate you. But there's a point at which those things can become obstacles in some ways, where you stop and you don't face certain dangers or risks or threats because you're afraid of what you're going to lose. You don't go over this hump because you have too much now that you have a stake in, and you're worried that every decision you make, every step you take might actually put the things you already have at risk. So a lot of my characters, and this is not just in this collection, I think this is something I've been wrestling with for a long time in a lot of stories, and it comes up again and again. There's a reason why a lot of these characters tend to be suburban or middle-class coded families, where these people are worried about their houses, their homes, their kids, whatever it is. And that sometimes stops them from, this is very loaded, I shouldn't say this, but doing the right thing, to helping other people, helping themselves, bettering their situations. There's a real inertia. There's a phenomenon where I feel like once you hit a certain point, you stagnate, and that can be really dangerous for a lot of people in a lot of situations. And I'm projecting, obviously, in a lot of ways. I'm clearly talking about things that worry me about myself or people I know. But I think there is this tendency, and it's very widespread, to stop yourself from doing what you would otherwise do if you had no attachments, or if you really thought about it in the abstract and you go, you know what? No, this person needs my help. I got to do this. There's a real tendency towards inaction that runs through these stories.
And I think that's realistic of the world, right? Of reality of how the world. But sorry, Shaun.
No, well, I feel like the question I was going to ask has now been answered, because you when you were talking and leading to this moment of this sort of notion of inaction, in discussing that, you're kind of revealing some of the things that I noticed in going through the stories, whereas many of the subject matters of so many of the stories, the genre elements are sometimes very subdued in the stories. I mean, occasionally they're kind of in your face, but they're not like exploding laser beams in your face, kind of. They're very subdued, and a lot of the narrative world, the sort of like world itself, is, I would describe it, kind of mundane. It feels more like normal places that people would exist in, with elements of the fantastic and so on. And as you're kind of describing that, it started to make me wonder about there being some sort of, maybe I'm just reading into this, almost like a weird tension that now exists between the fantastical element and the seemingly normal elements of these characters' lives and the lives they lead. Because so many of the stories, the fantastic is this thing that kind of exists on the side and is present, but it's never quite always allowed into their like lived experiences in all of the stories. And I was thinking like The Sort, which you've got like example of the tigers, right? The like genetically modified tiger man creature. I don't know quite what to describe him. The way he's presented to us is sort of very matter of fact, but it's almost like the characters, like they look at him as like they looked at a ball of twine, like a giant ball of twine, and then that's kind of it. And where all the real story is their little subtle interactions between the father and their child, and the sort of way in which this world operates very subtly. I realize there's no question there. It's just me trying to make sense of all of this. I thought The Sort was very interesting, by the way.
No, no. Well, thank you for saying that. I know we're not supposed to pick favorites among our story children, but the Sword is one that I really personally, there's a lot of stuff in there that I'm attached to, and I really like that one. So I'm glad that one spoke to you. And I know there's no question in there, but I think I can morph it. I'm gonna like in my head turn it into question and try to react to what you were saying, because I think that's really interesting. Your observations. I think there's two things that I kind of hear in that I react to. I think you're right that there is a pattern in a lot of these stories where the characters and the center of the story is about people trying to preserve normalcy for themselves. A lot of them, not always, but they have a sense of what is normal and what is, their daily life that they want to go on with. And then there are these elements, usually horrific, but not always. Sometimes it's like the tiger, where it's this kind of just odd thing that's on the periphery, that's protruding into their lives, sometimes disrupting their lives, that they're trying to keep at bay. And it's, until you said that, I did not even think of that as a tension or, a border that was being ruptured between normal and fantastical. But I do think there is an element of that. So I think that's true. But the second thing that, I sort of started thinking about when you said that, especially the tiger example, where you have this father and son who are on a road trip. They stop in a small town, and one of the sights they see is this genetically modified tiger in a city hall that's sitting there that can say limited number of words to them. You're right that you're right that they just kind of look at it like it's any old thing. And for me, it's funny. I think that's a technique, and maybe it's a crutch, I don't know, but it's something I like to rely on for fantastical elements for things like these. I think it is more unsettling or more of an alarm bell for readers for whatever reason. I think they hone in much more when characters treat those sorts of things as normal. Children especially are interesting storytelling devices for these things, because there is so much that children as viewpoint characters take for granted. You can twist that in different ways. A child character can view a situation with such simple moral clarity and be an outsider in some ways and be like, this is right, this is wrong, we should help, we should not help, on the one hand. But on the other hand, children sometimes are just like, yeah, no, this is the world. So for example, Window Boy, which starts the collection, it's very purposefully told tightly from a young boy's perspective, because he takes for granted, for example, that his mailman is a cyborg who walks up with like weeping eyes and is very strange looking. But to him, perfectly ordinary. He does not comment on it. He barely describes it to himself. The grackles, which are one of the major ominous things that are looming outside of the point of view of the main character, again, it's a cartoon character for him. It's a show thing. It's something that he knows about but doesn't feel like he has to explain. So for me, at least, and this goes back to what we talked about much earlier about verisimilitude, reality, strangeness, I actually believe the weirdest things about the way we live our lives, we do not question, actually. We never stop and think to ourselves about, I don't know, the magic of our cell phones or whatever it is that we're doing, this laptop, how I'm speaking to you on my computer, very odd things that just happen, or social situations, the way our government runs, or the way we treat each other on a daily basis. There are a bunch of things that we just take for granted that we never break down in our heads the way you would in a fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel, for example, and talk about like here's our culture and here's why we do the things we do. We just do them. And a reader who is seeing that from the outside, I think it's a great device to make them sit up and pay much more attention to what's going on, because usually it freaks them out, as it should. And I think if you were to put a lot of our mundane stuff in a different context, you'd probably have the same effect on someone who didn't understand the time we were living in.
Oh, 100%. You're completely right, too, that it has this effect of making you pay more attention, because I know this is a genre collection, right? And so I'm expecting there to be stuff, but then you do this thing where things appear in here that are so subtle, and you won't spend a lot of time on them in the story. They just kind of are there, and then the story kind of moves, it continues its way, and these little elements are there. So for me, it's me trying to like tease out, how does this thing work? What is its operation in this world? Some of the stories I think are a little less subtle. I don't think that's a bad thing. That's just the way they function. But that subtlety has this effect of the second something that doesn't quite seem normal appears, you suddenly are razor focused of like, okay, what is that? And now you're looking for all the little clues that can sort of tell you. Maybe that's my professor brain working. But that, I think, is something you do remarkably well here in so many of these stories, that I just kept stopping and going, that's a thing I need to pay attention to, because this is going to come back. It happened in The Sort. It happened even in Window Boy, because I was like sitting there going, what is happening in this moment? There's something off about this, something strange, and I was picking up the pieces. Several of the stories were like that for me. I don't know how you do that. I genuinely don't.
That's it. That's also, I was very impressed with that. And that's the fun thing of it, because just pigeoning or adding on to something you said, Shaun, there's fun in trying to figure out, is what I'm uncertain about something I'm certain about because it's foreign to me? Or is it something the character is uncertain in this world, but it should be really, really familiar to me, but it's described by somebody that doesn't really understand it. So I'm trying to say, is he talking about this? Or is this something fantasy land and completely mystical or completely sci-fi? Or is it something and that is just so much fun.
Thank you, guys. I mean, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. I try. It doesn't always work. I'm always experimenting. And like you said, Shaun, I mean, I think in different stories, if is a slider on the weirdness and the subtleness or whatever it is, sometimes you got to go weirder, and sometimes you got to go much more straightforward depending on the scenario. And it's funny that you just mentioned, Daniel, is this a fantastical term? Because there are times, I will admit, I push the limits even for myself, and I know it's gonna trip some people up. But an example, what I thought of when you were saying that was in this collection towards the end, I think Alabama Circus Punk is a story.
Yes.
Yeah, where the number one reader
So
reaction
much fun.
the first time they go through, and again, how do I do this without spoiling? But there's a device in there where as you're reading it, I think many people understandably for the first like half of the story, you're like, oh, well, these terms are just it's a sci-fi world, it's fantastical, we're far future. So whatever lingo they're using, that must be slang or code or something. And you just kind of, it's odd, but you push it to the side and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going. And then when you hit like the 3/4 mark or close to the end, when it really starts to ramp up and it's explained to you what this device is, and oh no, this is not code or slang. Something is wrong, and that wrongness has hit a critical point, and it's now exploding. You go, oh, I get it, I get it. And there's a risk with that, and I totally, again, I cannot fault a reader who just like throws their book across the room or just like, rolls their eyes and goes like, okay, like, you got me, or thanks a lot. Like you're being very clever here. Like I understand why you might want to give up before you get to that point, or even if you get to that point where you're like, juice was not worth the squeeze. The puzzle was do it for me. I think that's fine, but there's a certain type of reader where if you pull it off and they like that kind of thing, I think it's a lot of fun. So that's the goal, I think, for those kinds of devices and those stories. But again, not for everybody.
Yeah, I can imagine some people might find it gimmicky, or because that's something, authors, if you like to write, sometimes you go for that and want to try out something that's gimmicky. That it definitely didn't play that way for me. And sometimes things that do play too gimmicky for me. So I think, it walks a great line.
It does make me want to ask the question, given that this is a whole short story collection, you've written quite a few short stories. Do you find that form, the short story, in any way kind of encourages you to take greater narrative risks with how you would tell a story?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No question. I think, and I haven't done a ton of podcasting interviews and everything, but for this book, I've had to sort of practice and learn and think about these things a little bit more and articulate them. So I've repeated this a couple of times and I've been thinking about it, but I've heard a lot of people use this analogy. I think I finally figured out where it came from. I think it's from Julio Cortázar, a short fiction writer. But I think he makes the analogy of short story writing as like if you're boxing, it is the knockout punch. It is the huge hit where you concentrate your ideas, you give it your all, and you knock somebody out. Or you don't, but it's a knockout punch versus something like a novel where it's a long boxing match. You have a lot of rounds. You have to have endurance. It's more technical. You got to win on technical points. And it's just a very different game. And the thing about that analogy that I like, and the thing about the knockout punch is you do a knockout punch and then the boxing match is over. But you can do a lot more boxing matches when you do it that way. You can schedule them much closer in time. Now the metaphor is falling apart, but you can do a lot more matches and really iterate and play in a way that I think is much harder with novels. And it's just the nature of the publication schedule, the timeline. It takes years to bake and then put out there. But with a short story, it's a lot more rapid fire, and I think that encourages more iteration and play. So I personally am a fan, and I think it was what led to this collection really was a lot of the iteration about the ideas of uncertainty. I was like, this is coalescing around something. I am writing a lot of stories that are slight mutations of the same thing. Maybe the relationships are a little different. Maybe the threat is slightly of a different nature. But tackling the same thing. So maybe if I bundle these up, they will have things to say in relation to each other, or a reader might react differently reading one next to the other. So I do personally think short fiction is a little bit more of that experimental, you're just constantly going back and forth with the reader and you get in real time a lot faster of a reaction, whether something works, whether it doesn't work, whether it hits with a group versus not. I think I think that's why I'm addicted to it, frankly. I think I don't know if I could sit for years on end and work on a novel without that rapid fire feeling that short fiction brings.
You kind of raised this issue now that not issue this element of in putting this collection together, we're sort of been talking about common themes. Some of these stories have been previously published, and some of them are original, like Uncertain Suns, which is original. When you were assembling all of making decisions about what was going to go in here, how much was thinking about the interconnections part of that process before you put what was in here? And was, I guess, the second part of that question to be Uncertain Suns in particular, which is the title story. Was that a thing you had beforehand, or was that a thing you made specifically for this?
Yeah. Let me think about how to answer this and stall for time by first of all saying and plugging. I should have done this at the top of the hour, but the publisher of this book, Undertow Publications, they are very unique indie publishing house that has like a very, to me at least, like a singular voice in the sense that they cultivate a lot of, maybe younger is not the right word because we're all varying ages, newer, newer indie authors in a lot of interesting ways, whether it's in anthologies or year's best. They have a year's best weird that around for a while and went away, but is coming back this fall, and also single author collections that are fantastic. And it's run by Michael Kelly, and he's got a team there: Carolyn McDonald, Vince Haig. They all, I think, put out books with a very strong sense. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Shaun, about how everything feels contemporary or like in the mundane world. So when I was thinking about this collection and where to pitch it, part of that process was thinking about, what is Undertow like? Because I'll be honest, even before it was fully assembled, they were the ones I wanted to approach. I just knew in my gut that I wanted to work with Michael Kelly and his team. And so that kind of narrowed things automatically because I sometimes do write a little bit more high fantasy or very, very obviously far future or, interplanetary stories, that sort of thing. But because I knew that they have a vibe of this could happen in the real world, the weird creeps into our environment, stories had to have a certain flavor. So that ended up informing a lot of what I ended up gathering. Um, I did not know if they would be open to a collection at that time. I had worked with them on a short story in Weird Horror Magazine a few years ago. And then it just kind of all came together when Michael Kelly, I think, was looking for something longer. And I had started to assemble this again with them in mind, but he didn't know that. And he approached me and he said, do you have anything longer? And I said, yeah, I did. Or maybe it was the other way around. It's so fuzzy now. But when that happened, Uncertain Suns was just an idea. It was like on a piece of paper. I think I had written House Traveler, which I knew was going to be like a part one, essentially laying out the thesis of change versus stagnation, status quo versus putting things at risk. And then I had just finished The Sort and had just sold it. And I was starting Uncertain Suns. So I had the title. I said, I have this thing, Uncertain Suns. Do you want to see it? And he said, yeah, sure, sure, sure. And then I went in a mad dash to finish putting it all down and draft it. And then I sent it to him. And then luckily, it all kind of came together from there. So that was really long. But I think the short answer to your question is it was a combination. I had to like think about it beforehand, and I was gearing up to pitch it to them, but not all the pieces were done before I like showed it to them for the first time.
Was it a conversation between you and them in terms of the order of the pieces then? Because this really does seem like an album in the sense of like everything's meticulously kind of placed to like almost even like if it had an A side and a B side in terms of, like it's going to stop here and then we're picking back up on the other side of the album.
Yeah, it was there were some conversations back and forth. Michael was very thoughtful about, what he thought would work and didn't work. But to be very frank, I mean, Undertow was very hands off too, in the sense that they let me kind of make the final decision or really think about it. They weren't like pressuring me like, nah, this is not going to work. You got to do it like this, or you got to do it like that. So the way it actually worked was what I sent them was much longer. It was like a over 300 pages, 15 stories type of version. And it was like my platonic ideal, my academic intellectual thesis kind of story collection where I was like, ah, yes, like this is my James Joyce, Dubliners, whatever. Like it's going to connect in these brilliant ways and it's going to be wonderful. And then the problem was I sat down and I read it and I went, oh God, this is awful. I was like, this is terrible. It was, on paper or in the abstract, very well planned. Like House Traveler, for example, used to open the collection as a very clear frame. It was so disorienting and so abstract and really just dropped readers in out of nowhere that I was like, there's no way. If I'm a first time short fiction reader and I pick up this collection, I'm going to bounce on this in like 10 pages. It just didn't work. And I also had initially broken it up in more arcs where, maybe let's say the first third of the collection was similar stories of people, let's say, denying the threat that was confronting them. And maybe the second third was a little bit more mixed. It was people not quite self-actualized, but struggling to confront. And then the last third was a little bit more confronting your problems, whatever, however you want to categorize it. And the problem with that was you read 2-3 stories in a row that had the same vibe. It's so repetitive. And if you're on a downer stretch, oh man, it is such a downer. So Michael and I talked about it, and I tried a few different things, sent it back and forth. And ultimately, what you end up seeing is a little bit more of more variety. So there are some balancer stories in there that I think are palette cleansers that change the vibe a little bit. They still fit within the aesthetic and the feel, but they're not, it's not relentless downer followed by another relentless downer. I think it's a little bit more of a change. And I think the other thing is the weirdness ramps up over the course of the collection. Window Boy, I think, is more of an entryway because it starts with a lot of familiar environment and then introduces the weird stuff. It's not like an Alabama Circus Punk, which is by the end, you're bracing yourself for something odd to go wrong. So you're like, okay, I'll accept this. I think that was much more what we decided on. And like you said, like an album style, thinking about the listener experience, the reader experience, this is much more smooth, I think. I hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm finding this very interesting because we haven't had a chance, as I had said at the very beginning, to actually interview people who've released, like, were the actual collections the thing we're talking about. Mostly we've got novels or we've had novellas, and then we've had people on who have done short story collections, but they've done like a novel, and so that's why they've come on. So short.
And we've talked about many collections just amongst ourselves.
Correct. Yeah.
But never with the
not with the person who was in part of the process for assembling it all. And so I find it very interesting that there's so much deliberate intentionality in the choices of the stories, which I find so interesting in part because many of these stories were previously published. And so there was no point in their existence when they could have originally been thought of for this thing. They were just a story that you then sent out. And then in sort of trying to think about how they could all interact with each other, you have to essentially like look at how they thematically tie, tonally tie, narratively, etc., and work together so that they create a reader experience, which is, I don't know. There's something about that. It is so like intellectually really curious to me.
I hope so. I mean, otherwise, this is going to be very boring for your listeners. But
Yes.
I've always wanted to. No, I've always like really wanted to sit down with other writers, especially ones who have done collections, and like what their process was like. Because I don't know what they had to do, but like I had to print it all out in hard copy, for example, and literally, move the pieces around. Digitally, you can kind of do it, but it's not quite the same as flipping from one story to the next or then switching them around in the order and checking the transitions. I've always wanted to kind of sit down and talk to other collection curators, I guess, or whatever, people who've done this thing to find out what their methods are, because It really is. Again, this is my first time going through it, but I do think you want to be thoughtful. And even if it's previously published stories, um, there are certain things where I had inklings in mind where certain stories might relate to each other or threads might be picked up from one to the other. So, it's an interesting process to see how you can put those pieces together. And again, not frustrate a reader or make them want to to run away after the third story in a row where someone dies at the end or something like that.
I imagine as a writer, an element that is there is you become differently familiar with your own work, given the percentage that are from elsewhere. And I say differently familiar. I don't want to suggest your relationship to the stories, I think, is different than their initial publication life was presented, if that makes sense. Would you say that's kind of how you felt?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I think when you sit there and you really look at them again, especially years later, out of context, like out of the magazines, and then next to other stories, it gets also painfully embarrassing and like a little bit like exposing to like look at what you fixate on, and you're like, why am I so fixated on this issue or this thing? Like, what am I saying about myself? I'm telling on myself to strangers in this way. And then it goes down to the sentence level, to all the crutches, all the typos, the things that you just have done over the years. You're like, oh, this is so embarrassing. I think my wife, who she reads a lot of these and she helps edit. She's a writer as well in a totally different sphere. So she always has her own thoughts about certain things. And she's like, man, your endings, for example, I'm not going to say what it is, but there's a certain thing I rely on too much, where she's just like, you do this a lot. And when you line these up, you've done it 5 times in a row. Do you realize that? And I go, oh my God, you're right. I had no idea. And it just really makes you rethink, and it makes you a little bit, I don't want to say paranoid, but much more aware and self-conscious of your patterns in a way that you just kind of be like when you're in the trenches and you're just subbing story after story after story. Because you also just never know what's gonna even be sold, for example. Like, you don't know what's gonna make it out the door versus just sit in your trunk. You just got to try everything. And then so when you assemble things, you really start to see, let me be positive too, not just the warts. There are strengths or things that you like that you come back to and you go, oh, that's nice. I'm glad I did that. Or that's interesting. I forgot I did that. And you can appreciate those things with distance when you're putting the collection together.
Another positive might be also that you're because so many of them were originally published elsewhere over many different periods of time, you're also starting to notice what possibly editors might have seen at them at that moment, because they obviously loved it enough they wanted it. And so I hope that as the author, right, you're sitting there kind of going, okay, but like, what was it? What was it that nabbed them? Because they were the editorial reader. And maybe you take that home with you and like, there's some things I could replicate and take.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Before we're out of time, there's one story I did want to ask about, because it's one that really resonated with me. I read it twice, and it's kind of like the person who wrote the introduction to the collection. I'd have a hard time saying like favorite stories, but this was definitely one of the most impactful, and that was The Mub. Because to me, it was one of the scariest stories I've ever read in my life, which may sound odd to you. I'm not sure. But like, to me, what really hit was that the story, I read it almost as, I have no idea what you intended with it, but almost like technology, like AI technology. I kept thinking of coming and annoying you with like, hey, try this. Are you using AI to do things? Like, hey, we have AI services to write for you. And it just scared me of like having to live in a world like this where this was happening. It felt very real. And now, which might be different than when you had originally written it or not. But it made me think that story, and at least one of the other ones, are almost like cautionary tales on technology. So I was curious, is that something that resonates with you in terms of like, you like technology, but you're also very wary of it? Or is that just something that you're delving into with sort of your your uncertain, weird fiction, as opposed to ones that are maybe more standard sci-fi or standard epic fantasy?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tough for me to distinguish what is just me being an anxious person about life and the world in general. I'm a very risk-averse person in general. New experiences, I like predictability and constants, but I do think as a person, if I'm being very frank, I do have a lot of wariness about technology and not the technology itself, which is almost always,
Mhm.
never the issue. It's how it's applied, it's how it's marketed, it's how it's used. And it's funny you bring up the mub. I mean, that's another one that's like the sort where I couldn't say it at the time, because you never know what people glom onto, and you don't want to say, this is my favorite. That's not my favorite. But the mub was one where I personally was very invested in that one as well, like the sort. And I have a rule where I never say what inspired a story, especially if it's recorded, because in this age, once the author says
Mhm.
what it is and it becomes searchable, that's what it is. Right. Or it's weighted
Mhm.
towards that. But so many people have. So let me put it this way. Regardless of my intent, a lot of people have ascribed generative AI to the mub. And it came out at a time, let's say, where generative AI was becoming a thing that you were starting to see everywhere, but was not quite as ever present and jammed down your throat as it is now. So I think that people are probably right to pick up on that, but I also think that what you say too about technology generally and how it could be, an anxiety about technology more abstractly, I think that's also correct. I do think the thing I was going for, regardless of whatever the inspiration was that feeling that exactly what you're talking about, which is here's something that is annoying. Maybe it's even kind of funny, the way it talks, it moves, it's goofy. It's really goofy, but it's doing things that are not funny. And at a certain point, it reaches a critical mass where it's starting to destroy infrastructure and get in the way of a lot of things. And then it's really not funny. And I think there's a character, I think the man in the hat on the horse, the cowboy character
Mhm.
essentially, who's a real jerk, who says something along the lines, I think he has a line like they're funny or stupid or whatever it is until they're not, until they get dangerous. That's the essence of the line at least. And that's really the thesis behind that story is, there are these things that seem like funny little marketing gimmicks, but then they're not. Then they destroy basic structures and things you rely on, and that's a huge problem. And I don't think that's just generative AI. That's definitely where we're seeing a lot of that kind of corrosiveness, I think, now.
It's like in shitification on steroids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. Does that even answer the question? I don't know. I don't even.
No,
No,
it
it
did.
did. It did.
No, it did.
You're good.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, and I want to say, oh, you know what? I don't know if I can say specifically, but I've heard from someone that the mub and the sort are going to be in some sort of like I'm going to try to be vague, but like an academic text on weird fiction as
Hmm.
examples of a certain thing in sort of our this era that we're in now. And I was very
Oh, congratulations.
no, thanks. No, but
That's
I was
really
I was
cool.
at the mub in particular, that the way you pointed out those themes, I think that's what a few people who like it, and there's not many, but the few people who like it, that's what they glom onto.
Oh.
And I'm glad.
That's why I reread it, because it's not obviously necessarily about that. And the first time I read it, I continued with the collection. And then I was like, you know what? I'm starting to pick up on things in these stories. I need to go back and restart some things. So I went back and started rereading some of the earlier stories and picking up on it. Was like, was my initial reaction, am I going to have that same reaction now revisiting the story? And I didn't get to do that because of time for the second half of the book. I am looking forward to doing that for the second half of the book as well.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for reading it more than once. That's the hope, right? People go back. So thanks.
Well, I don't mean to be a buzzkill, but we have to wrap up because we're running out of time and people Thomas, specifically, you have a life.
Yeah.
So,
well, we do have one important question I do need to ask.
Okay.
And that, based on your website, I'm curious, what are the virtues of spam musubi?
Oh, well, I mean, it's delicious, first of all. It's a great portable snack. You can take it anywhere. You can take it on hikes. It's many forms of it. Although now on the mainland, I've seen like restaurants do really wild things to the point where I'm like, that's not even a spam musubi anymore, where they like turn it into like an elaborate meal. It's just gone wild now. I don't know about spam musubi culture on the mainland now, but classic spam musubi, little soy sauce, little sugar, wrapped in seaweed, perfect. You can eat it, take it anywhere. I highly recommend it. Everyone's got to grab one. That's my spiel.
I mean, I agree.
I'm going to have to try it now. I've never had it, so
you had me at spam.
Good.
So folks would like to know what's coming next. Do you have anything you can kind of talk about at this moment?
I think it's going to be promo for the Uncertain Suns collection for the near future, so you'll probably see me pop up on places like this for the next couple months. And then after that, I'm hoping to just put my head down and get back to the short stories. So you'll probably see me in magazines soon.
And then if folks want to find you, where would be the best places to go?
Probably my website, thomashallwrites.com, but realistically, I pretty much live on Blue Sky. I'm always just hanging around there, not talking about writing, probably just silly stuff. Don't expect anything serious from my Blue Sky. Don't expect like analyses of technology or anything like my fiction. It's not serious there.
I need to take a page out of that book and just be more silly.
Yeah,
it helps with sanity.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Thomas, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us about this book, because it had, by the way, we did not talk about the cover, but the cover is super cool.
Oh yeah.
Right. So the cover's awesome. But also thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, the cover's awesome. Wonderful painter did it. I'm blanking on the name. I think it's Uwe Topfer. He's very talented. Love the cover. And thank you again. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, for folks at home, if you'd like to let us know what you thought about the episode, if you are familiar with Thomas's work and you want to say what you think about the collection, or just want to generally talk about it, there are two places: skiffyandfanty@gmail.com, or if you're in the Patreon Discord, you can obviously talk in the show discussion channel. We're on all sorts of places, Blue Sky, Threads, blah, 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 blah. That is skiffyandfanty.com/skiffythings if you want to find us there. And then remember, every Friday, 7 p.m. Central, at twitch.tv/alphabetstreams, we do our live show, different show every week, sometimes interviews like this one. So please come. And then if you like what we do, the best way to support us is telling people that we exist, and then reviewing us, and then patreon.com/skiffyandfanty, which gets you access to the Discord and all kinds of other fun stuff, including voting in the Torture Cinema poll, where you make us watch a movie that we don't want to watch. Sometimes they're actually good, so it's really not that big a deal. As for Patreon supporters, we have a whole bunch to name real quick. So thank you all very much to Andrea the Alluring, Cameron the... I cannot say this word, Daniel. Can you say it for me?
Chthonic.
Thank you. Caroline the Benevolent, Carrie the Divine, Chris the Candescent, Dan the Transient, Daniel the Cultured, David the Debonair, JC the Jocular, Jeff the Gracious, Joseph the Jovial, Juan the Junctional, KB the Kind, Karen the Kickass, and Cat the Kidomatic.
Matthew the Magnificent, Paul the Pious, Phoebe the Eloquent, Robert the Riveting, Robin the Bold, Ryan the Resilient, Sarah A. the Sensational, Sarah E. the Sublime, and Sarah O. the Rapturous, Scott the Gentleman, Stephen the Strange, Thierry the Thorough, Tanya the Triumphant, Trish the Imperturbable, and Victor the Valiant.
Thanks, everybody. I'm SeanDuke.net. Just add a /Duke things if you want to find my socials. I'm Alphabet Streams here on Twitch as well.
You can find me, Daniel, at reading1000lives.com. That's the numeral 1000 in there. And, of course, the Skiffy and Fanty blog.
Absolutely. All right, as required by the Skiffy and Fanny bylaws, I must make this happy. Which I'm going to do by letting Daniel know that I have got you a ticket to the new amusement park of talking animals.
Is there an aardvark?
No, but there is a giant semi-sentient bacteria.
Okay, that is awesome. And after reading the collection, as long as there are no balloon animals there,
No balloon
we'll be
animals.
good.
Yeah. On that note, happy ending and scene.